The bobcat appeared at dawn, his coat matted with mud, his breathing shallow, his eyes half-closed from exhaustion. He limped through the cattails at the edge of Miller's Pond, a stretch of wetland just outside Ashland, Wisconsin, where the water met the birch forest in a tangle of reeds and moss. His right hind leg dragged slightly, a deep gash visible along his flank, crusted with dried blood. He was young, maybe 10 months old, still learning the hard edges of survival. And he was alone. He collapsed near the water's edge, too tired to drink, too broken to care. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the pond. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called. The bobcat's ears twitched, but he didn't lift his head. He just lay there, ribs rising and falling in uneven rhythm, waiting for whatever came next. What came next was the sound of tiny voices. Soft, urgent, desperate. The bobcat's eyes opened. Just barely. Through the reeds, not 10 feet away, he saw them. A clutch of ducklings, 7 in all, huddled together in a tight ball near the shoreline. Their down was still pale yellow, their bodies no bigger than tennis balls. They were calling out, high-pitched peeps that echoed across the water. But there was no mother. No protective wings. No shelter. The bobcat watched them through half-lidded eyes. He didn't move. He didn't have the strength. But something in their cries stirred something old in him, something that had nothing to do with hunger. It was instinct, yes, but not the kind anyone would expect. It was the instinct to stay. To witness. To guard. And so he did. For hours, the bobcat lay motionless in the reeds while the ducklings huddled together, calling for a mother who never came. The sun climbed higher. The air grew warm. And still, the bobcat didn't leave. He just watched, silent, steady, like a shadow that refused to fade. By midday, a woman named Elena Cortez had arrived at the pond with her 8-year-old daughter, Mia. They came every Saturday to sketch the wildlife, to sit quietly and let the world unfold around them. Elena was an illustrator, and Mia was learning to see the world the way her mother did, with patience, with wonder, with reverence for the small and fragile things. They set up their folding chairs near the north bank, sketchbooks open, pencils ready. Mia was drawing a dragonfly when she heard it. The peeping. Faint, but insistent. She looked up, scanning the reeds. "Mom," she whispered. "Do you hear that?" Elena tilted her head, listening. Then she stood, shading her eyes against the sun. "Stay here," she said softly. But Mia was already following, her small boots squelching through the mud. They moved carefully, quietly, until they reached the edge of the cattails. And then they saw them. The ducklings, huddled together, trembling. And just beyond them, barely visible in the shadows, the bobcat. Elena's breath caught. She grabbed Mia's arm, pulling her back instinctively. But Mia didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stared, her eyes wide with something that looked less like fear and more like awe. "Mom," she whispered. "He's not moving." Elena looked closer. The bobcat's eyes were open, but there was no tension in his body. No crouch. No predatory stillness. He was just lying there, watching the ducklings the same way they were watching him. And then she saw the wound. The blood. The shallow rise and fall of his chest. "He's hurt," Elena said quietly. She pulled out her phone, hands shaking, and dialed the local wildlife rescue. But even as she spoke to the dispatcher, she couldn't take her eyes off the scene in front of her. The bobcat, broken and bleeding, lying just feet away from 7 defenseless ducklings. And doing nothing. Protecting them, in his own way, simply by staying. The rescue team arrived 30 minutes later. 2 volunteers in canvas jackets, carrying a crate and a tranquilizer kit. Elena explained what she'd seen, her voice tight with disbelief. "He's been there the whole time. He hasn't moved. He hasn't touched them." The older volunteer, a man named Ben, knelt at the edge of the reeds and peered through the cattails. He exhaled slowly. "That's a juvenile male," he said. "Injured, dehydrated, probably starving. And he's lying next to a meal he won't take." "Why?" Mia asked, her voice small but urgent. Ben didn't answer right away. He just watched the bobcat, his expression unreadable. Sometimes, he said finally, an animal knows when it's not alone in needing help. They approached carefully, speaking in low tones, moving with practiced slowness. The bobcat's eyes tracked them, but he didn't run. He didn't hiss. He just lay there, too weak to fight, too tired to flee. When Ben reached him, he placed a hand gently on the bobcat's side. The animal flinched, but didn't snap. "Easy," Ben murmured. "We've got you." They lifted him into the crate, his body limp, his breathing shallow. And as they carried him away, Mia turned back toward the ducklings. They were still huddled together, still calling out. "What about them?" she asked. Elena knelt beside her daughter. "We'll stay," she said. "We'll watch over them until someone comes." And they did. For the next 2 hours, Elena and Mia sat beside the ducklings, shielding them from the sun, keeping watch for predators. They called the local wildlife center again, reported the abandoned clutch, and waited. When the second rescue team arrived, they carefully gathered the ducklings into a soft-lined box, their tiny bodies warm and trembling. "You did good," one of the volunteers said to Mia. "You kept them safe." Mia nodded, but her eyes were distant. The bobcat kept them safe first. That night, at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, the bobcat was stabilized. His wound was cleaned, stitched, treated with antibiotics. He was given fluids, warmth, and a quiet space to heal. Ben stayed with him through the night, watching his breathing even out, his body slowly relax. And in the morning, when the bobcat opened his eyes fully for the first time, Ben saw something he'd never forget. Not fear. Not wildness. Just exhaustion, and relief, and something that looked almost like trust. Meanwhile, across town, the ducklings were placed in a brooder under heat lamps. They huddled together just as they had in the reeds, their soft peeps filling the small room. A volunteer named Sarah checked on them every hour, feeding them, keeping them warm. And every time she looked at them, she thought of the bobcat who had lain beside them, broken and bleeding, and chosen not to harm. 3 days later, Ben brought Elena and Mia to the center. He wanted them to see what they'd helped save. They stood outside the bobcat's enclosure, watching him move slowly across the space, his limp still visible but improving. His coat had been cleaned, his eyes were bright, and his body, though thin, was beginning to heal. "He's going to make it," Ben said. "Thanks to you." Mia pressed her hands against the glass. "Can we see the ducklings too?" Ben smiled. "Follow me." In the brooder room, the ducklings had grown. Their down was thicker now, their movements more confident. They waddled around the enclosure, pecking at food, chirping softly. Mia knelt beside the glass, her breath fogging the surface. "They're okay," she whispered. Elena placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "They're more than okay. They're thriving." But it was what happened next that no one expected. Ben had an idea, one that went against protocol, against logic, against everything he'd been trained to believe. But he couldn't shake the image of the bobcat lying beside those ducklings, guarding them when he had every reason not to. So he made a call. He reached out to Dr. Lena Park, a wildlife behaviorist who specialized in interspecies dynamics. He sent her the photos, the notes, the timeline. And he asked a question that felt impossible. Could they be reintroduced? Together. Dr. Park arrived 2 days later. She spent hours reviewing the case, observing the bobcat, watching footage of the ducklings. And then she did something unprecedented. She approved a supervised introduction. Not in the wild. Not permanently. But in a controlled environment, to see if the bond that had formed in crisis could exist in calm. They set up a neutral space, a large outdoor enclosure with water, grass, and shade. The bobcat was brought in first, his movements cautious but calm. Then, one by one, the ducklings were released. They waddled into the space, their tiny feet pattering across the grass. And then they saw him. The bobcat turned his head, his eyes locking onto the small yellow bodies. He didn't move. He just watched. And then, impossibly, the ducklings moved toward him. Not in fear. Not in confusion. But in recognition. They gathered near his front paws, peeping softly, as if they remembered. As if some part of them knew he was the shadow that had stayed when everything else had left. The bobcat lowered his head, sniffing them gently. He didn't bite. He didn't swipe. He just lay down, slow and careful, and let them huddle against his side. Elena covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Mia stood frozen, her eyes wide. He remembers them, she whispered. Ben nodded, his throat tight. And they remember him. The footage went viral within days. News outlets picked it up. Scientists debated it. And people everywhere watched in stunned silence as a wild predator lay peacefully beside the prey he should have hunted. But those who had been there, who had seen it firsthand, knew the truth. This wasn't about breaking instinct. It was about something deeper. It was about survival recognizing survival. Pain recognizing pain. And choosing, in the midst of it all, to protect instead of destroy. The bobcat was eventually released back into the wild, his wound healed, his strength restored. The ducklings were raised until they could fly, then released near the same pond where they'd been found. And though they never saw each other again, the story remained. A reminder that even in the wildest hearts, there is room for mercy. That even in the darkest moments, there is space for grace. Elena framed the sketch Mia had drawn that day. A bobcat lying in the reeds, 7 tiny ducklings huddled at his side. She hung it above her desk, where she could see it every morning. And every time she looked at it, she remembered what her daughter had said. The bobcat kept them safe first. Because sometimes, the fiercest protectors are the ones who know what it means to be broken. And sometimes, hope doesn't roar. It limps. It bleeds. And it stays anyway.